Wait, this can't be real. This ring holds a terrible power. This is Sacred, or more specifically Sacred Gold Edition, which is the definitive version of the game that includes the original release and the 2 content updates that were released after. It's been a long time since I've gone back to take a look at an older game, and since isometric ARPGs are one of my favorite genres, it seemed like a perfect fit. If we look at the timeline of how this genre developed, Sacred hit the scene in 2004, not long after Diablo 2 defined the entire genre for the next 2 decades. This game has had some rough competition, but it makes some interesting moves, and I think it might end up being one of the most influential games in the genre very soon. But before we get deeper into Sacred, I need to issue a quick disclaimer. This video is a review and not a guide. This game is pretty complex, and I easily could have done a 30-minute video just analyzing the skill system, so if you're looking for the top 10 most epic Sacred speedrun builds, or an in-depth tutorial on how to mathematically break the game's combat system, you'll need to look for another video. I'm also definitely going to miss a few important points, I'm sure. If you're wondering how much playtime you could potentially get out of this game, the fact that I put 50 hours into it, mostly with one of the game's several classes, and I'm still going to miss a few details, should probably tell you all you need to know. When you start Sacred, you'll be asked to choose a difficulty and a class, and you'll be exposed to this game's extremely early 2000s full voiceover.
I'm a gladiator, an expert in close combat and trained in all types of weapons. I feel most at home in two-handed combat, man to man, where I knock my opponent down with hard blows and taunt him as I send him into the next world.
I would suggest starting on the Silver difficulty to begin with. Silver is still pretty easy, especially if you play these types of games a lot. And let's face it, if you're looking at Sacred's Steam page in 2020 and thinking about buying it enough to where you typed Sacred Gold review into YouTube, you're probably the type of person who plays these games a lot. You also aren't going to unlock harder difficulties unless you beat the game on Silver first. The difficulty of the game is also going to depend on which class you pick. For example, the first class I played was the Vampirus, which just happened to be one of the most broken classes in the game. The Vampirus switches between 2 forms, a human form and a vampire form. The idea here was that since this game has a day-night cycle, during the day you would be a sort of mediocre melee class, but at night you would be an extremely powerful vampire. The problem is, the damage your vampire form takes from the sun is basically nothing, so it becomes very easy to just be a vampire all the time. Second, when you turn into a vampire, you use an unarmed attack that does your weapon's damage at a fixed attack speed that is extremely high. This means that you can equip a very slow two-handed weapon that does massive damage and do absolutely insane damage. Eventually I decided that I should probably play something a little bit more reasonable and switch to the Battle Mage.
I'm a battle mage.
And then I found this staff at level 20 that gave all of my melee attacks and spells 15% lifesteal, and I was pretty much invincible. So expect some really goofy itemization and design choices in a game this old. That being said, around level 60 or so, it did get to the point where this life leech wasn't enough, so maybe it is balanced. Anyway, once you start the game, it's the same gameplay you would expect from the genre. Fight through waves of enemies, pick up items with too many stats on them, turn small number into big number. I think we all get how Diablo clones work at this point, but Sacred's system for building characters is pretty complicated, so I think it would be fair to go over how it works in some detail. First, we have attributes. Each character has access to the same attributes, and these are pretty standard. Strength increases health and melee damage, endurance will increase your defense, charisma will get you better prices in shops, and none of this is very interesting. Once you get into skills, things get a little more customizable. Every character starts with 2 skills, and at certain levels you'll be able to choose an additional skill from the skill pool your class has access to. You distribute points into skills the same way you distribute points into your attributes, but you get to customize this stat block to the type of playstyle you're going for. Just be careful to not accidentally click on the wrong one though, or else you'll end up with sword lore on a staff mage and waste a skill slot for the entire playthrough. Next we get to the combat arts and the combat system, which is where things really go off the rails. All of your spells and attacks in Sacred are called combat arts. Each character has a large list of combat arts they can learn, and you unlock them by finding the right rune and reading it. Every time you read a rune for the same spell after this, you'll increase that spell by 1 level. As you play, you'll notice that most of the runes you pick up will be from one of the game's other classes and not yours. This might seem annoying at first, but the game is built around this, and you can trade 4 runes with certain NPCs for a rune of your choice for your class. You will get fewer and fewer rune drops the more you have read and the more you have hoarded in your character's inventory and stash, so you generally only want to level up the skills you actually plan on using. For example, I wanted to go with a fire build on this battle mage, so I only learned the fire skills and a couple I thought would be worth the buffs during melee combat. It's also worth noting that you can only have up to 5 of these combat arts equipped in these slots, so even if you unlocked every skill, you wouldn't be able to use them all on the fly. The other important part about the skill system is the combo system, and this is where things really get complicated, but I'll try to explain it as concisely as possible. At the NPC that handles runes, you can also combine combat arts in groups of up to 4 to form combos. This can be used to cast multiple spells in a row while only taking up one of your slots. For example, on this character, I have 2 summoning skills set up in a combo, so I can summon both summons with 1 slot, instead of having both skills take up 2 slots. There are also some unexpected uses for this system, like the ability to buff a spell to a higher level than you would normally have access to. This is done by socketing runes into your armor sockets. Then, when you cast a skill through a combo, the game takes into account all of your socketed skills and your learned skills and combines them in a way that makes their total significantly higher. Honestly, this seems like some kind of math error. I don't think the developers intended for the system to be used this way, but it can be. You can also choose to cast the same spell 4 times in a row. There are a lot of skill combos that you can experiment with, and this adds a lot to a character build, and makes the 5-slot limit on your spells a little bit more forgiving. The biggest limitation on this system is the length of the combo cooldowns. If you want to use a character that makes use of a lot of combos, you'll need to heavily invest in spell regeneration to get your cooldowns as low as possible. You'll notice I didn't make much use of combos during my playthrough, and that's mostly because I didn't really understand how they worked most of the time. This is definitely the type of game you're going to need to play through once or twice to get a real handle on it, unless you do some reading ahead of time. If you want to read an extremely in-depth explanation on how all of this works, you can look at this long-ass guide, but I'm going to have to cut it off here or this video will turn into an hour-long mechanical analysis of this game's math system, and that's not really what I'm trying to do here. The takeaway from the perspective of a general review should be this. Sacred's skills, combat arts, and combos allow for a shitload of character customization and choices, but the system is also self-limiting enough to the point where you do feel like you're playing a class. This is unfortunate because this entire system is begging to be utilized in a game with classless progression. Imagine if instead of choosing one of these classes at the start and being assigned 2 starting skills and having to draw from this specific pool of skills and this specific pool of combat arts, you instead created a character without a defined class, chose its 2 starting skills, chose its skills from the entire skill pool, and then could read any rune on any character. Sacred seems like it was built for classless progression and used classes anyway, which normally I would say is dumb, but honestly, at the point in time this game was developed in, the genre was still in its infancy, and no one really knew how to unlock its full potential yet, so I can't really blame the developers for doing what worked best at the time, which was a class system. Now that we've covered most of the big brain stuff, let's get into some more surprising design choices. The place where Sacred really defines itself as a unique experience is its open world map. Some areas are gated behind story progression, but for the most part, you can go to any place on the map at level 1 with very few exceptions. There are also mounts that make your travel faster. The game's world will constantly scale up low-level areas to approximately match your level, so you don't need to worry much about running into an area that is too low of a level. Scaling up an entire game world like this well is something that even modern games struggle to do. I was genuinely surprised at how smooth enemy scaling was in a game from 2004. Todd needs to take some notes on this one. This game's open world exploration does have two major problems though: drop tables and side quests. Let's start with the side quest issue first. Sacred's map is made up of a massive, sprawling countryside dotted with small villages and a large town or two surrounding a massive capital city. The map is very, very large. This map is so goddamn big that it took me 40 hours to finish the main campaign, and according to the game's stats, I covered about 15% of the map. This sounds exciting because everyone wants to explore a giant game world and see what it has to offer. Sacred primarily has two things to offer: hidden dungeons like this cave, and side quests which can usually be picked up at one of the game's many small towns. The problem with side quests is they're all extremely boring and quickly become not worth the time. These are almost all exclusively MMO-style fetch quests and kill quests. They award very little experience, and the items they drop are almost always garbage. Quests seem to have a higher chance of giving you runes, so they're pretty important when starting a new character to get your starting spells, but very quickly you'll find that you can get more items and more experience by just playing Goblin Simulator. There are a few highlights where side quests get a little more interesting. For example, I was exploring the desert and found a boat to an orc resort island, and then found a quest to step on orc beach towels to bait them into a fight to the death, and then the quest reward was this stupid ass sunglasses item. I would have liked a lot more unique stuff like this, but after clearing out most quests in most villages, I can tell you the overwhelming majority of them are extremely uninteresting. Okay, so I've got the sunglasses, and I've got the ring. Why am I not getting the Flavor Town set bonus? Oh shit, I probably need the shirt. The next big problem with exploration is loot tables. Remember earlier how I said the item drops for quests kind of suck? Well, the item drops for chests also suck. Which means when you find a cave off the beaten path and you get excited, thinking that maybe you're going to find something good, odds are you won't. I was expecting there to be some kind of big reward chest in hidden dungeons, or maybe a bigger enemy with a bigger drop pool, but this never really happened. Every time I explored the map and I found a dungeon, it was just more of the same stuff you can find anywhere else on the map. This, combined with the boring side quests, eventually led to me just rushing through the main storyline and not really bothering with a lot of side content. Even the Dragon Horde chests didn't seem to have higher drop rates. In the defense of this game though, when it comes to item drops from actual combat, that part is done well. As you play through the game, you'll notice some enemies have blue or gold names and are significantly stronger than normal enemies. These guys will have a higher chance to drop better items. So while Sacred's open world design kind of drops the ball a little bit, it does exactly what it needs to do in terms of its combat system, so it still functions very well as a Diablo clone. The last part of the open world I want to talk about is the mount system. As you play, you'll find a lot of horses for sale. You can buy these and use them as mounts, and the game has a full mounted combat system. Some weapons are better while you ride, like staffs or other polearms, and some are less effective while mounted. It's the same with spells. For example, Fireball has a much longer cast time while mounted than on foot. This isn't something we really have seen in this genre before or since up until very recently, which I'll get into later. The only real problem I had with the mount system is that I think it forced the developers to make one really, really annoying design choice in the form of shitloads of enemies that can snare you. The problem with mounts is, it's possible to find a fast one and basically just ignore combat. In order to counter this, the developers added a lot of monsters that can just stop you in your tracks and force a fight. I should be fighting because it's fun, not because the enemy forced me to stop. I'm not sure how well this game was playtested, but if there was a point during playtests where players were using mounts to skip combat like this, the developers probably should have asked, what can we do to make combat more rewarding, not what can we do to force players to play how we want. These snares really slow down the flow of the game, and this genre is all about flow. That pretty much covers Sacred in terms of its mechanics. Sacred experimented a lot with the Diablo formula. Some of it was very successful, and some of it fell a little flat. In terms of being a classic gear grind math fest, it works. In terms of trying to adapt the genre into more of an open world RPG, it misses the mark a little bit. But I think if we consider this game as a product of its time, it's very good. If you're the type of person that enjoys classic games and enjoys the genre, you will enjoy Sacred. And it does go on sale for less than $5 pretty often, so you don't really have a lot to lose. I'm also excited to try this game's sequel in the future because it was very well received, and I'm going to assume that it fixed some of the problems of Sacred 1 and probably expanded a lot on a lot of Sacred 1's ideas. Now that we've covered game design, I want to take a look at some of Sacred's creative choices, and why I think Sacred could potentially end up being one of the most influential games in the entire genre. I know that second one sounds insane, but trust me, it'll make sense soon. First, let's talk about voice acting. I don't actually need to say anything about this, I just need to play one clip.
Welcomes to Globanur. Poor Globa. Bad demons in cellar. If you help me, it makes bad demons splat. Globa gives you prezi. Nice book. All blacks with goldfish face. But Globa not a read. Messer Globa. Master of Globanur.
Next, let's talk about the sprite work. I really enjoyed the classic sprite work of Sacred, especially the large cityscapes like this one. This is part of the colossal capital city, and it would take you several minutes to actually navigate the entire thing. Hopefully you can see how nice the structures look. The inside of buildings also have a surprising amount of detail, considering how easy it would have been to just not even include interiors for basically every building. If that isn't enough to convince you, here's another shot I liked. There are also a lot of small items of polish, like horses leaving hoofprints in sand, or the game's weather cycle that cycles through rain and fog. Sacred really tried to make itself feel like a plausible world, and not just a series of dungeons. This is even reflected in the geography of the map. The southern part of the map is a desert, and the farther to the northwest you get, you transition into large plains, and then temperate forests, and then cold mountains. It's almost like the same progression you would see starting in the American Southwest, and then making your way up into the Canadian tundra. This sort of coherent world isn't something that I've seen done in this genre as well as Sacred. Even games like Titan Quest and Grim Dawn that have larger worlds don't really feel as coherent. Of course, I should mention the second half of the game takes place in the underworld where Earth rules don't really apply and the map kind of does whatever it wants, but that's a different story. Also, check out how before the underworld campaign, this demon just grabs this lady like an ice cream cone.
Yeah.
Okay, this is the part of the video where I start to engage in some wild speculation. Let's look at the main bullet points for Sacred as a game. Sacred has classic isometric ARPG combat, massive open world, lots of villages and towns and side quests, big world bosses, mounts, and a mounted combat system. Recently, as of my writing this, Diablo 4 has been announced, and we have been given a lot of information on what Blizzard plans to do with the game and the series. Let's look at some of the biggest bullet points for what we know about Diablo 4 so far. Diablo 4 has a classic isometric ARPG combat system, a massive open world, lots of villages, towns, and side quests, big world bosses, mounts, and a mounted combat system. I don't think this is a coincidence. Blizzard knows they blew it with Diablo 3, and they know they kind of fucked up with Diablo Immortal, and Path of Exile just keeps getting better and better, and there are a lot of other developers out there trying to get a piece of the pie in this genre. So if Diablo 4 doesn't perform well, Blizzard risks having to shelf one of its most popular franchises. In order to compete, Blizzard needed to do some wild shit with Diablo 4, and if they actually deliver what they are claiming to want to deliver with Diablo 4, it might end up being the best game in its genre. And if it really did take a large amount of inspiration from Sacred, which is entirely possible, it might end up being that Sacred will end up being the one that defined the future of the genre, which would be an extremely wacky twist. Or Blizzard just decided to convert the World of Warcraft formula into Diablo because they're hacks. You decide. If you want to see more videos like this one, consider subscribing. Leaving a like and a comment also really help out. You should also follow my Twitter so you don't miss any important updates. I've also been considering opening up some more community-oriented stuff since the channel has been having some pretty crazy growth lately. Let me know about what you guys think of stuff like a Discord channel or a Patreon, or if you have any other ideas to help build the community around the channel. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.